Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra daf Kaf Zayin. We are actually going to finish the second parak today and move on tomorrow to Cheskat Habatim. Like I told you before, it's one of the most central parakim of Shas, very much learned in yeshivas. Anyway, we're going to get there soon. So we're going to finish up now with a few different topics. Our main topic for the bulk of the shiur is what we started with Ulla yesterday. Okay, just the beginning will be some mathematical calculations that might get a drop more complicated than yesterday, but not to worry. Either you can follow all the mathematical equations or not. It's really not the biggest deal. We'll just go through them and you'll get the numbers and you'll see what they're doing with them. So Amar Ulla, okay, just to go back for a quick minute, Ulla basically says, if your tree is next to the boundary of your friend, okay, let's pull up the pictures. I did new pictures for today. Let's pull them up. Okay, so if you have a tree that's 16 cubits from your neighbor's border, then according to Ulla, okay, that's the first picture on the left here. It's 16. Let me make this a little bit bigger and move over here. 1 second. So if your field is 16 cubits from your neighbor's field, okay, and then from all different directions, that's how we got to a box of 32 by 32, which is basically the space in which we assume this tree can gain nourishment from. That's a space of 32 by 32, which is 1,024 square cubits. Then you don't bring bikurim because you're basically, your tree is, so to speak, stealing from your neighbor's field by taking nutrients. So anywhere from, I just want to clarify, anywhere from 0 to 16, we're going to assume it's taking nutrients from your neighbor's field. You do not bring bikurim, which also means you're exempt, okay, which we're going to call this a kula soon, because it basically means instead of having to go to the temple and bring your first fruits, you actually don't have to. Then we tried to figure out where did he get it from. We brought this 10 small saplings in a field. We're not going to go back to that one. The numbers didn't work. Then we went to the second source, which we already discussed yesterday, but we'll discuss it again because it goes really into today's stuff, which is 2 lines from the bottom of Kaf Vav Amud Bet. Elami Ditnam. Perhaps we can learn it from the next Mishna, a different Mishna, which is if you have 3 different trees that are bigger trees, not these saplings we were talking about before, where the saplings are actually at a heter to do it to Rosh Hashanah. Now you have these trees that are 3 large trees in a space of a beit se'ah. Horshin kol beit se'ah b'shvilan. We basically, instead of saying these are 3 individual trees and each one just has the space, underneath it that you can actually plow just around the tree. No, we view this entire thing as one complete field. Now, this is the way it works. A few laws you need to know. If it's a field of grains, then you really can't plow after Pesach. But if it's a tree field, you're allowed to plow the field until Shavuos, because the whole issue is this is before the Shemitah year, which starts in September, Rosh Hashanah time. But we want to make sure, for what purpose would you be plowing if not for the upcoming year and for planting the upcoming year, which is why obviously wheat fields are going to be different because you're not replanting tree fields. But the point is you can't, even a tree field, you're not allowed to plow after Shavuos, but you do have until Shavuos. So the question is, do we treat this as a field of trees? Once you have 3 trees in a space of our beit se'ah, which is 2,500 cubits, then square cubits, then you can already say each tree, right? It's divided into 3. Each one is completely right. This entire space is being used for the 3 trees. So if you say that, you're basically saying you have the measurement of what one tree takes nourishment from, because we'll divide 2,500 divided by 3, we get 833. So in a space, each tree has a space of 833 square cubits. Now you can already know that this is not going to be the same as ours, because our space we came up with has 1,024 cubits. This is going to be less. And we already got to the number, which is, right, kama havu lahu. So how much is this? Trei alpe b'chamesh me'ah garmidam in the Gemara now on our daf. It's 2,500 square cubits in a beit se'ah. That's just a known fact. L'kol chad kama matele. So each tree, how much does it get? Again, 2,500 divided by 3. Tam nemea, 800. Utaltin utlata v'tilta. Right, 833 and a third. Okay, I didn't add the third here, but it's and a third. Now they say, but that's not going to work because the square root of that is 28.8. Divide that by 2, you get 14.4. which means that the radius here, meaning the line you draw from a tree till the neighbor's field, right, in terms of saying, does it get nutrients, is going to be only 14.4, not 16. So akate nefishele de Ulla. So Ulla's shiur here doesn't work because Ulla's shiur is greater, right? He says 16. This Mishna says 14.4. So we're closer, but we're not that close. Okay. So Gita, you're asking regardless of how the trees are placed in the field. So the truth is, I didn't really talk about this, but they're evenly spaced. Okay, I'm pretty sure in all these cases, they have to be evenly spaced and not that they're a whole bunch in one area and one separately. Okay, we're talking evenly spaced. So now the Gemara says, well, if you remember now, if math isn't your thing, well, I won't say it wasn't a thing of the rabbis, but the rabbis certainly didn't deal with decimals and things like that. So the Gemara says, so what if Ulla's a little bit greater number? Lo dak. You could say Ulla rounded. He rounded from 14.4 to 16. You know, he looked at that Mishnah and he kind of came up with approximately and said 16. Okay, and he said, let's just round it up to 16. Okay, well now, in laws of rounding, okay, well, I didn't need to do that, sorry. I'm going to use this tool of the whiteboard. Okay, we want to scoot down to here now. Now, if you're going to say lo dak, Ulla is going to be, now, if you say, I round it up to be, in halacha, you're going to do it to be more strict, not to be more lenient. Now this, imur damrina lo dak lechumra. If you're going to say you round it up or round it down, you're going to do it to be more strict. Lekula lo dak miamrina. But nobody says that you're going to round to be more lenient. Now let's talk about why this is lenient. Because if you remember, what Ulla was saying was, if your tree is so close to your neighbor's field, or even distance up to 16, we're going to exempt you. Now, if the real number is 14.4, that you'll be exempt up to 14.4. If you're within 14.4 of your neighbor, you're exempt from bikurim. Ulla is going to say, we'll give you even till 16 to exempt you. Well, then you're being exempt from a halacha of Torah law. That's a leniency to basically say, oh, you don't have to bring bikurim. You don't have to schlep them to the temple. You can eat them yourself. You don't have to bring them to the kohanim. That's an extreme leniency. Nobody rounds up to be lenient. They round up to be, or round down in this case, to be machmir. So rounding down will work, but rounding up won't work. So therefore, they reject this possibility. So now we're going to go to our next explanation. Okay, this looks a little bit complicated, but it's not so complicated. So now the rabbis say, well, the whole premise of how you did your comparison was wrong. Because misavar b'ribua kamrina. Now, I want to remind you, we had the square footage of the three trees case. We didn't have the square footage of our space, right? We just came up with the number 1024 because we said we're talking about a square. And if it's 16, so then 16, right? That's the radius. The whole across would be 32. 32 by 32 would get us to 1024. And that got us to this larger number than 833. So when you're going to take this, right, what you're going to say, this is 16, and that's going to be 14.4. But who says that we're talking about in a ribua? If by logic, forget about that, it's going to work better with Ulla. But logic would state, okay, don't get worried about the picture if you don't understand what's going on here. I'll explain it all as we go on. But if you say that we have a space that the tree, the roots go out and get nutrients, it makes a lot of sense that we draw a circle around it and not a square. So, right, that just makes sense because it's going to go out in every direction, a radius of 16, which is going to give us a circle and not a square. And it also helps us with our numbers because, right, so let's read it. Who says beribua kamrina, beigula kamrina? It really should be a circle. Now, here's the mathematical, what we call pi, the rabbis called 3. Okay, they didn't have 3.14, et cetera, et cetera. They just went with 3. And their theory was, right? The square amas, or square footage, or whatever it would be, of a circle is 3/4 the amount of a square, right? If you had the same radius there in a square or in a circle, you're going to have, basically, it's going to be 3 to 4. Okay, and that's what pi is basically, except it's not 3 exactly, but the rabbis called it 3. If so, pashalu shvamea v'shitin utimnaya. So now, right, you're going to get to 768. Why? Because it's very simple math. 1,024 times 0.75, which is how you get to 3/4 of it, is going to give you 768. Okay, so now you're going to say, in our one case of Ulla, the circle, right? If you're going to draw a circle with a 16 radius, then you're going to have 16 amma radius. You're going to have a circle of 768. So we're going to say tree is yonik, takes nutrients from that kind of amount of square ammas. Now let's compare it to our other tree, our 3 trees. So if you do a circle instead, that it's 2,500 cubits in a circle around these 3 trees, and then you draw a circle around one of those trees, or each of those trees, doesn't matter, but I did it around one, so it's not to make a super confusing chart. So now you're going to have a circle within that. That circle is going to have how many square cubits? Well, we already know 833. This isn't going to change because we knew the square cubits because it was told it was in a Beit Se'ah. We just didn't know is the Beit Se'ah square or a circle. But now that we turn everything into a circle, we're going to have a actually larger radius than before, because now it's the radius of a circle where the square, of a circle that's 833 and not a square that's 833. So you're going to end up, since it's a smaller section, you're going to end up with a larger radius. So now let's do area equals 3, right? And it's pi r squared, but for us, it's going to be 3r squared because that's the rabbi's formula. You're going to get, okay, if you plug in the numbers, you're going to have 833, which is the area, is equal to 3 times, and the number is going to be 16.67 times 16.67. Okay, so you're going to have 16 2/3 cubits is the number. So we're still not there because ours is 16, and that's 16 2/3. So that's what the Gemara is going to say. Akate. Okay, notice the Gemara doesn't go into all the calculations. They just tell you as if they know. So if you think they didn't know math, actually, I think they did know math pretty well. They just had different theories about math than us. Maybe the theories in those days, I don't know when pi was created, but the rabbis didn't have that. Akate pashle palga da amta. Still, you're up by half an amma. Now, it's not exactly half. It's 2/3. And Rashi says change it to 2/3. Okay, but palga, the word palga, we always use as half. It doesn't always mean half. Okay, palga is a part of. Plugta is a machloket. Machloket comes from the root halak, chelek, a part. So basically, we're still off by part of an amma. That's probably the most easiest way to explain this, which basically means we're off by 2/3. So that's not good because we're looking for 16, and this gets us to 16 2/3. However, in this case, Hainu de lodak ulechumra lodak, but now it's going to be lechumra. Now, why is it lechumra? Because according to the Mishna there that we quoted in Shvit, we're going to have 16.67 is the distance, right, from 0 to 16.67. You're basically taking nutrients from your neighbor's field, and you're going to be exempt from bikurim. Came Ulla, and he rounded it down to 16 and said only up to 16 you're going to be exempt. Past that, between 16 and 16.67, you'll actually be obligated. Well, that's lechumra, and there we end our section, okay? And with that, we've proven where, again, it's not the perfect proof, but where Ulla can come up with this number 16, where does it come from? Okay, now we're still not satisfied with Ulla because, so the first part we did was figure out where does he get his numbers from. Now we're going to move on and bring 4 sources that seem to contradict Ulla. It seemed to not have this 16 number that he's talking about and seem to have a much smaller number. Okay, then we're going to bring some other source, which actually seems to have a bigger number, which is a source we already know. And we'll get back to that soon. But Tashma, first we'll have the first 4, which seems to indicate either little or maybe something else. We'll see. Tashma, hakone ilan vikarkao. This is going to be about bikurim. If you buy a tree, just a tree in someone else's field, and you buy the land that goes with the tree, which we assume is a small bit of land, right? Like the land under the tree, directly under it, maybe the kohei. You bring bikurim on that tree and you read the text that goes with it. That's the Arami Ovedavi, we read it, part of it at the Seder. My love kolshu, this sounds like any bit of land. Now, we just said, if it's a small amount of land and your tree is getting nutrients from someone else's field, your tree is a thief. And again, because bikurim, it says you have to bring from your land. This isn't from your land. because it's taken from other people's land, and therefore you wouldn't be obligated. So here, they say you're obligated completely. So my love kolshu, right, sounded like we were just saying the tree, you bought a teeny little bit of land. To which the Gemara says, lo, tevav amma. Okay, it says yuvav, but I'm sorry, it should be tetzayin. Right, it's really 16 amma. Okay, so it's 16 cubits. This means if you buy a tree and the 16 cubits around it, that's how Ulla would explain that source. Okay, next source, Tashma. What about this? You buy 2 trees. Now you don't buy the land. You just buy the trees. Now here you don't own the land, so you don't bring bikurim. But it says only if you buy 2. The assumption is if you already buy 3 trees, then the assumption is when you buy 3 trees, this is like we saw before, the 3 trees, we view them as a unit within a space, which means that if I buy 3 trees from you, that are near each other, and I don't say I'm buying the land, or you don't say I'm selling you the land with it, it's obvious that I'm getting the land with it. And then it would then be the implied here is if you buy 2 trees, you don't bring bikurim on it because you don't own the land. But shlosha, if you had bought 3, maybe the koreh, you would bring and you would even read. Now, that means my lav kolshu, does that not include, we assume, now, what would I get them for that? Again, it's all an inference from this source. I would get 3 trees and the land right around it, but it didn't say up to 16 cubits around the 3 trees. So Gemara says again, like just before, right? Lo hachanami yod vavama. This is still 16 cubits. Okay. I just want to point out, right? We don't use yuvav. That's what I said before. We use tet zayin. We don't write yuvav. But in the Gemara here, in the text, at least in front of me, it says yudvav. Okay, which is the way of saying 16. Tashma, third source. Rabbi Akiva Omer. Now here's a din about karka kolshu. You have any little bit of land, you're already become obligated in a bunch of things, or it's relevant for all sorts of things. We're going to have 4 halachot. Only one is relevant to us, which is going to be the bikurim. Chayav bepe'ah. You already have to leave a corner of your field. This sounds strange. You have a teeny little bit of land. How are you going to leave a corner of your field? Well, the point is, if in that little small piece of land you can grow a bunch of grains, let's say, so you have to leave a small part of your grains for the poor people. If obviously you can only grow like 1 stalk of wheat, you don't have to leave anything. But we're talking about a small piece of land where you grew a bunch of things. Bikurim, you're obligated in bikurim on, let's say, a tree you have in that property. Okay, so that would imply, I just have a little bit of land. It says kolshu. Kolshu means a little bit. It doesn't mean 16 cubits worth. So that seems to be a contradiction, but we're going to continue anyway before we get back to resolving this. Kotvina la pruzbal. If you remember, we learned this already. Pruzbal is when your loan is supposed to be canceled in the Shemitah year. You lend money to someone you don't want it to be canceled, so you write a pruzbal, which is like giving it to the court, and then the court actually, there's no laws of Shemitah Ksafim, of cancellation of loans. But you can only write a pruzbal if the borrower has land. If they don't have land, it doesn't work. But if they have any bit of land, you can write a pruzbal contract. Okay, I'm not going to get into all the reasons why that is. I've learned it before, but anyway, that's just a fact. They need to have land. If you might remember, we had these cases where the malva, the lender, kind of gives them a piece of land so that he can write a pruzbal contract. Okay, so that's how because as long as you have some sort of piece of land, you don't need to own a big property. You just need to own some little square of land. Okay, and another thing about any little bit of land, another halacha we learned, remember we learned about a kinyan agav. You can acquire land with in 3 different ways, but you can't acquire metaltalin in those ways, like money, shtar, or chazaka. And if I do, let's say, a chazaka on the land, I do some act showing ownership of the land, and at the same time you would sold me some movables, even though that doesn't work for acquiring movables, right? You have to lift it, you have to move it, pull it, right? Depending on what it is. Or, there's multiple ways you could do it with movables, but they're not the same for land, right? Obviously, land can't be moved, so that's not going to work. There's different criteria, but if you did them together, in other words, I was buying your land and some furniture or something, and I purchased the land with a chazaka or with money, which doesn't work for the others, I actually acquire the metaltalin as well. And even if it's only a little piece of land. So anyway, the main point being the bikurim and even a little bit of land, to which the Gemara says, that land we were talking about was relating to land where you're going to plant grains, and not land where you're going to plant, now you might say grains, what you bring is bikurim, don't you bring fruits as bikurim? Well, Rashi points out, in case you didn't know, but what do you bring bikurim on? The 7 fruits, so to speak, that Israel is blessed with, and one of them is chita, right, or seorah. Now, chita, wheat, grows, it doesn't get nutrients. The roots don't go all the way far out like a tree. They stay very close. So we're talking about there, even karka kolshu, you'd be liable for bikurim, you'd be obligated for the grains that grow. But you wouldn't be obligated on a little piece of land if that's all you owned, if you put a fruit tree there. Because again, your fruit tree would be getting nutrients from someone else's land, and that wouldn't be something obligated in bikurim. So by saying it's talking about wheat, we basically resolve the contradiction. And daikanami dekatane kolshu also makes sense because it says a teeny little, like what are you going to plant in a teeny little piece of land? You need space to plant a tree. You don't need a lot of space to plant a grain, okay, or a little bit of grains. Shma mina, and that's all right, right? From here you can infer that it must be grains. It's not a contradiction. Fourth source to go against Ulla. Tashma, final one in this section. Ilan miksato ba'aretz u'miksato b'chutz la'aretz. Okay, now we have a tree growing on the border of Israel and outside of Israel. Now, why is this relevant? Because of mitzvot hatliyot ba'aretz, all the mitzvot that are dependent on the land. So this tree, do you have to take maaser on it? Because it's got part of the roots are in Israel and part of the roots are outside of Israel. So how do you deal with a tree like this? So Rebbe is the first opinion. He says, tevel v'chulim u'ravim zebazeh. We have both things that are obligated in Truma D'Maasrot, and we have fruits that are not obligated, and they're all mixed up together, and it's a big mess. Divrei Rebbe. Okay, and then you'd have to figure out how you deal with it according to Rebbe. But he views, the main thing for us is, he views this is all one tree with a big mush of all the roots that are underneath, right, which are half in Israel, half outside of Israel. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Hagadel b'chiyuv chayav, Hagadel b'patur patur. Okay, let's just put the Israel on the left side, outside of Israel on the right side. Everything on the left is Israel. Everything on the right is outside of Israel. So, in other words, assume, right, there's roots on both sides and there's fruits on both sides. So whatever fruits grow on the left are Israel, whatever fruits grow on the right are outside of Israel. And then those need maaser and those don't need maaser. So now the Gemara says, okay, so what does that have to do with us? Well, notice, ad kan lo pligi, they're going to assume nobody really disagrees with the following, okay? Ella, in other words, they only disagree about this point. Okay, so hold off, we're in the middle of a phrase. Ella, demar savar yesh breira, umar savar ein breira. Okay, breira, remember our crazy topic breira that's always a little bit complicated to understand? Breira is retroactive designation. What does that mean? It means that, let's say I have 100 fruits that come out of this tree, and since half of it's on one side, half it's on the other. So according to Rashbag, if we hold by breira, we're basically going to say, I'll take half, I'll treat them as if they were from Israel. And then by default, right, once I do that, I can basically say I'm going to retroactively designate those as ones that grew outside of Israel. Since it's all mixed up anyway, well, we can do retroactive designation. I'll call this tevel, I'll call that not. And with that, I'll resolve it. Now, it's not really the way we're going to understand it ultimately, because it's a little bit strange to do that. But that's what Rashbag says. And the rabbis say this is all mixed up because we can't use breira. We don't hold by breira. You can't just do retroactive designation and say, oh, I'll just call this the side of Israel, and therefore the rest will be by default not, okay? Or, it could be the reverse. I just gave that as an example, but you can't do that. And that's what their machloket is. But if that's the case, that that's all they're arguing about, everyone agrees though, aval gadel b'ptur divrei hakol patur. Everyone agrees though, that if the tree was only on one side, even though the roots get to the other side, right? And the roots might branch out there, it doesn't matter. It goes by where the tree is. If the tree is in Israel, it's Israel. If the tree is outside of Israel, it's outside of Israel, even though the roots might extend. So if we hold like Ulla, that up to 16 cubits is taking nourishment, then even if it wasn't on the border, it should be a problem. And nobody seemed to say that. So the Gemara is going to say, how can you resolve this? You could say that, what are they talking about here? Dimafsik tsunma. There must be a stone in between in the ground. We've used this before as an answer to things. There's stone in the ground underneath, which means, so we're on the border, we have a tree, the tree branches out, there's roots going this way, roots going that way, but there's a stone in the middle. So the roots from this side don't get to the other side, and the roots from that side don't get to the other side. And likewise, if our tree was 13 cubits away from the border, there was a stone there in the case that we're talking about. So when you infer, if it was all on one side, it wouldn't be a problem because there's a stone in the ground and the roots aren't getting there. So basically, you'd have to say there's some way the roots are being blocked. Well, if you're going to say that, my time in derive, then if the roots aren't connected at all, then we don't understand Rebbe. If the roots aren't connected, then why don't we just assume if there's roots on the left and roots on the right, and it's very clear which is which, then likewise, whatever grows on the left side of the tree will be Israel, and whatever grows on the right side of the tree will be outside of Israel. Why don't we just say it all follows the roots? The roots from the left side are going up the tree. If it's all separate by a stone in the ground, then we can assume that what's up top is also separate and grows separately. So the rabbi's opinion makes no sense. To which they say, no, Hadar Arve. No, in other words, when the roots are down in the ground, there's a stone in the middle. But when they grow back up and they're all connected in the same trunk, they kind of connect back together and the nutrients then go in all directions, right? And it could be that you'll have fruits up there that are connected. And that's the machloket. So then what's the root of their machloket? Mar savar avira mivalbel, umar savar halachudikai v'halachudikai. Each differ in how they view this tree growing. Do they connect back up at the top again when they're out in airspace? Because below ground, they for sure don't connect. But do they connect when they get into airspace, or do they not connect? Okay, and that's the machloka between them. But this has nothing to do with the 16 cubits because we explained that there's stone in the ground and the roots aren't going from one place to the other. Okay, so those were our 4 sources that seem to go against. Now this is another difficulty with Ulla. Again, from a Talmudic source, actually from a Mishna that we just learned. But I would say it's a bit of a different kind of question because it's not a matter of 16, and these seem to say you don't even need 6, right? Even like less than 16, it's not really taking any nutrients. It's not an issue. Here, we're going to go the other direction. Sheshes le'amav, too low. It's also the Gemara kind of puts it as a bit of a different kind of question. So let's assume, okay, the roots are going to go up to 16 cubits and they could take nourishment from the land. Past 16 cubits, no. So now the Gemara says, is that true? Past 16 cubits, there's no issue. V'hatnan, doesn't it say in the Mishnah, we just learned, marchikim et ha'ilan min abor kafei ama. You have to distance your tree from a pit 25 cubits. Now, let's do the math, right? 25 cubits, 16 cubits. That's not the same. So why would you have to, if the roots only go up to 16, then what are we worried about 25? To which they answer, no, these are 2 different issues, obviously. Amar Abaye, Mezel Tuva Azle. It's true the roots will go up to 25 cubits. And therefore, if the roots from your tree are going to grow up past 16, up to 25 cubits, they can destroy the wall of someone's pit. That could be. But what was Ulla talking about? Ulla was talking about the nutrients, right? The roots sapping nutrients from the ground and ruining your neighbor's property by basically ruining their soil by stealing the nutrients. That only goes up to 16. So that's what Abai says. It doesn't weaken the ground, the soil. Right? Once it's distant from the tree more than 16 cubits, it's no longer taking nutrients from the ground. So that's not a problem in terms of putting your tree near your neighbor. But if your neighbor has a bore there, then it will destroy their bore because the roots will still go. It doesn't matter whether they're sapping nutrients or not. They're going to grow into the wall of the pit and ruin the wall possibly and destroy the person's pit. So that's a totally different issue, and therefore the numbers are different. Okay, last part of the sugya, and then we'll move on. We have 2 more Mishnayot to finish up the chapter with small sections of the Gemara on them. Ki'ata Rav Dimi. And when Rav Dimi came from Israel, he brought Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. We're going to have 2 different versions, Rav Dimi's version of Rabbi Yochanan and Ravin's version of Rabbi Yochanan. And basically it's going to be a question, does he hold like Ulla or does he not hold like Ulla? So when Rav Dimi came from Israel, he told us the following. Rish Lakish asked Rabbi Yochanan exactly this question. Ilana samuch lemetzar betoch sheshes ama mahu. Okay, you have a tree next to the border within 16 cubits. What's the halacha? So it says exactly like Ulla, that tree is considered a thief, and therefore there's no bikurim. But ki'ata Ravin amar Rabbi Yochanan, when Ravin came though, he quoted Rabbi Yochanan the opposite. Echad ilana samuch lemetzal ve'echad ilana noteh mevi v'korei. Now, Not really because he disagreed with Ulla about whether it's yonik or not. Now, this is a totally different thing. It's really fascinating. A tree that's next to the border of a neighbor, okay, within, let's say, the 16 cubits, or a tree that my fruits, right, my tree, okay, I have a mango tree right now, and the fruits are half in my property and half in my neighbor's property. Of course, the ones that are getting riper faster are in their property because it's much sunnier on that side. There's these beautiful mangoes. It's the first year I've actually really finally gotten mangoes. And there's this beautiful tree, mangoes hanging over. Now, whose fruits are those? The ones on his side, even though it comes from my tree, are actually my neighbor's tree fruits, okay? By halachically. But comes Rabbi Yochanan and says, both if my nutrients are taking from my neighbor and if my fruits are hanging over my neighbor's property, mevi vekore, okay? I can still, if I pick those fruits, I will bring bikurim on them, even though theoretically they belong to my neighbor. And if my tree was sapping nutrients from my neighbor, which we just said makes my tree a thief, no, my tree is not a thief. I actually can bring bikurim and even read the section on it, which means I'm definitely obligated. Sha'al minat came hinchil Yoshua l'Yisrael ta'aretz. Fascinating line, right? We've seen this in other things before. The Yoshua gave us the land to get along nicely and be, generous with each other. That if they're my mangoes that came from my tree, my neighbor should be nice and let me use them. Okay, I don't know if he will. He's got a beautiful mango tree in his backyard anyway. But that's the issue, that the land was given to us to not, and it's fascinating to be ending this whole section with this line about, even though there's my part, your part, and the whole thing is about dividing and all that, we end with this possible statement of Rabbi Yochanan. We don't really know if Rabbi Yochanan said it because it seems to contradict what Rav Dimi said Rabbi Yochanan said. But again, maybe what Rav Dimi is quoting is the actual halacha, and this is beyond, right? This is saying, well, in general, people should live in a way that they're generous, that, oh, my fruits are leaning into your property. Well, you should be generous and say, they're really from your tree. And my fruits took from your nutrient, took nutrients from your field. Say, that's okay. We live together as neighbors, I don't mind if you do that. And that's, kind of talking about a certain ideal, and how Yehoshua gave us the land. He divided it, and yes, you got your portion and I got my portion, but it's not meant to be divided in a way that I should be insistent on everything that's mine and you should be insistent on everything that's yours, but more to be shared. A very nice idea. Okay, now we're going to move on. 2 more Mishnayot, and like I said, small sections of Gemara on them. Ilan shu notel esteh chavero. Now we talk about trees that are leaning into the neighbor's property. Okay, I could talk about all these cases from situations I had. I had a tree that was majorly intertwined into my property. It was a really thick branch that grew horizontally from the neighbor's field all the way into my field. It actually came from like a diagonal neighbor, and it came in such a windy way. So if it's in my field and it's bothering me, okay, here it was actually ruining my other trees because it had wrapped itself around my other trees. It was a whole thing, a whole to do. But anyway, this is more not that kind of issue, but this is that right now, when I'm going to plow my field, I keep hitting into these trees above me, these branches that are coming out into my field. So kotzetz melo mardeh al gabei machresha. Until what height can I cut? Well, I can cut if when I do my plow, there was a stick they would use to prod the animals to move. And when I plow my field with my stick and trying to get my animals to move, it would hit into it. So if it's at that height, I can cut it down. Higher than that, say, you can say to me, you can't cut my branches. I don't know why you would care that I would cut your branches that are leaning into my property, but it seems that that's an issue. And I can only do it to the height where it's bothering me. But if it's charuv or shikma, keneged hamishkol. But if it's the charuv and the shikma, which have very thick branches, which create a lot of shade, which is not good for my property, then I can actually cut to what they call it the mishkolet, which seemed to be some way that they would measure boundaries. They would put a string and they would hang something, and that way it would be like a straight line down to figure out where exactly the border is. And it's called the plumb line. And you put, that basically means the border of your neighbor, okay? So you can cut right onto your border, right where your border is, anything that juts into your property. If it's a big sycamore tree or a carob tree, which has big, thick branches, you're allowed to cut right along the border. Beit HaShlachim, If it's a field where it needs a lot of irrigation, or bring water in to irrigate, then the shade is really bad for it. We're going to see this in the Gemara. The shade is bad. It doesn't allow the water to be absorbed. And therefore, kol ha'ilan keneged hamishkol. Any tree I can cut on the plumb line, because any tree, it doesn't need to be with thick branches, any kind of tree is causing shade, which is bad for my field. Abba Shaul Omer, and it's a debate we'll see in the Gemara, or a question in the Gemara, to which line is this referring? He disagrees about something in the Mishnah and says, kol ilan strak, any non-fruit bearing tree, keneged hamishkolet. You can cut right up along the border there on the plumb line, any non-fruit bearing tree. So we buy the Gemara asks, Abba Shaul arei shakai or sepakai? Is he referring to the first line in the Mishnah or the last line in the Mishnah? So what would that mean? Either he says, when it says charuva shikma, you can cut on the border, and he says, no, only a non-fruit bearing tree. Okay, not, let's say, carob, which has fruits on it. Okay, only non-fruit bearing trees. Or he says, beit hashlachin, any tree, neged hamishkolet. And he said, I'm sorry, I think I said that wrong. Let's go back to the beginning. I'm not sure now what I said, but let me just clarify. Charuv and shikma are the only ones that can go according to Tanakama neged hamishkolet. And he says not only charuv and shikma, but any non-fruit bearing tree. In other words, he's much more expansive here. Any non-fruit bearing tree you could cut on the border, because again, what's the issue? And here this highlights, according to Abba Shaul, the issue is you can't cut, but why can't I cut your branches that are in my field? Because they're fruit bearing trees. Remember, you're not allowed to cut fruit bearing trees. So he says, as long as they're not fruit bearing trees, it doesn't have to be that they're thick branches, even thin branches, as long as they're not fruit bearing, you can cut your neighbor's trees that are, branches that are in your property. If it's on the seifa, then it's beit hashlachin, right? If it's an irrigated field, one that needs irrigation, then any ilan neged hamishkolet. And he says, no, only non-fruit bearing trees. Okay, even if it's shading and messing up your property, if they're fruit bearing trees, you can't cut them. So which one does he mean? Abba Shaul arei shakai or sepakai? Is referring to the beginning or to the end? Tashma, let's learn it from here. Tanya, it says in a Braita, beit hashlachin, and then we'll know what he says about the beit hashlachin. Abba Shaul omer kol ha'ilan keneged hamishkolet. Any tree can be cut on the plumb line. Why? Because shade is bad for beit hashlachin. So he clearly says, like the end of the Mishnah, which means he doesn't disagree with it. Shema minat must be a reisha kai. Shema minat must be he disagrees with the reisha, which again means we thought only a charuv and shikma can be cut along the plumb line, and he says any non-fruit bearing tree also can be cut on the plumb line. And they're going to further prove that this is the way to read it, because Rav Ashi matniti nami daika. You can also infer from the language that Abba Shaul uses in the Mishnah, because dekatani kol ilan strak. He says every fruit-bearing tree, every non-fruit-bearing tree. Now, iyamar bishlama arei shakai. Now, why did he use the word every? So, if you say it's on the first part, hainu dekatani kol ilan, that's why he said, because they said only charuv and shikma, right, sycamore and carob, and he says any non-fruit-bearing tree, right, every non-fruit-bearing tree, meaning I'm including a lot more. But iyamar seifakai, ilan strak mebaile. It shouldn't say every ilan strak, because the seifa said every tree you can cut on the plumb line in a beit hashlachin, in an irrigated field. And he said, no, only ilan strak. And that doesn't fit with the words all ilan strak, right? It's not the right language. So elalav shema mina, reisha kai shema mina. Must be referring to the reisha. Okay, next Mishnah. Ilan shu notel l'reshut harabim. Here we get into public property. What rights does the public have to cut trees of others? And here gets into all discussion. You can listen to Machshava Shniya and Second Thought of Yafi Clymer about this week that went up yesterday, all about what are our rights? Who does the public property belong to? Are we owners of it? Is nobody owner of it? How do we view public property? This Mishnah really gets at it, which is, if your tree is going into the public domain, so a camel rider, right, on his camel or her camel, the height of the camel and the person on it. Okay, because camels travel through and you can't get in the way, right? You can cut if it's going to hit you, just like the mardea we had, right? If it's going to hit someone's head while they're riding on a camel, so we can cut that tree. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, gamal ta'um pishtan o chabiles mochot, not a camel with a person on it, but a camel with a load on it. Now the Gemara is going to ask which is higher. Okay, we'll talk about that soon. Rabbi Shimon Omer, kol ha'ilan keneged hamishkolet. Rabbi Shimon says any tree can be cut. He disagrees with the other two opinions. Any tree can be cut along the plumb line of the public domain. Why? Because of impurity. Okay, what we're really going to see, and we'll see this later in the Gemara, the issue is if there's a dead bones or something, a dead body underneath, and there's a tree above it, and the tree creates like a tent. And anywhere under that branch you walk under, even though there's not impurity under that part of the branch, you're basically going to become impure. So to avoid extra situations of impurity in the public domain, we basically say you have to cut, you could cut down the tree. So that would be any tree and not just with the ones, it doesn't matter the issue of the height. So now the Gemara asks an interesting question. Now, I don't know if you would have thought about this, but Mantana de benizakin batal umdena dahashtazlin. I was thinking about this. The reason I mentioned my neighbor's tree was they had this big thick tree that was growing in. And the question is, how far could I cut it? Could I even go into their property and say, I want to cut in your property because I don't have this problem going into the future, right? Or do we say, no, when it starts going in the future, just cut it there, right? Do I have any right to go into their field and cut? I actually can't remember anymore. I do know the gardener had to go into their field, into their garden, but I don't remember if it was just to cut, right on the border, or it was actually to cut a little bit more. I don't remember, but that's really the issue here. Now, who's the Tan of our Mishnah who basically says, we're only worried about right now, what damage is causing now, and not that in 2 months' time, if I don't cut into your property, in 2 months' time, it's going to come right back. Now, that's not what it says. It says along the plumb line. It doesn't say I can go into, right, the public can go into your property because in another month or so, it's going to grow into the public domain and again create a problem. So who's the Tana who holds this? So Amar Rish Lakish, Rabbi Eliezer. Rish Lakish says this is subject to Tanaitic debate. And it's just in general, Nizakim. Ditnan, look at this Mishnah. You can't dig a pit in the middle of the public domain, even if you put a cover on it, like under the ground, because what will happen down the road, the cover might wear away and someone will fall right in. Rabbi Eliezer Matil. Eliezer says, you can do it. Just make sure that if a wagon drove over this cover right now, full of heavy stones, it wouldn't break it. If it's that solid, you don't have to worry about it. Now, even though we all know that over time, it'll wear away and someone could accidentally fall in it at some point in the future, Rabbi Eliezer isn't worried about that. So he's clearly the Tana who holds this way, and that's what Rish Lakish says. But Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Filu Tema Rabbanan, Rabbi Yochanan says, I can explain the Mishnah even according to the rabbis, because that case is not comparable. Hatam Zimni Demifchi Velabadate. There, the reason why the rabbis were strict was because they said, well, one day it'll wear away, no one will know, and they'll fall right into the pit and die, or get injured. But hacha kama kakaitzle. Here, there's no danger. Here, as soon as you see the tree coming, you'll just cut it. So there's no reason to go into the neighbor's property and cut even more. So it's not the same kind of issue. So we have a machloket. Is it a machloket or is it not a machloket? Rabbi Yehuda Omer. So we buy it. As I told you, we're going to ask. Shiur de Rabbi Yehuda nafish or shiur de Rabbana nafish? Which one is higher? The person on the camel or the load on the camel? So they have an interesting way of proving it. They say, Pshita de shiur de Rabbanan nafish. It's clear the rabbis is taller, the person on it. Tisakadate shiura de Rabbi Yehuda nafish. If you think that it's taller than to have the load, well, Rabbanan b'shiur de Rabbi Yehuda hechi avde. So how would the rabbis, if the shear, if let's say we say you can only cut at a certain, at a certain height to make sure the person, if the person's shorter than the load, then how's the load going to get by? If you don't cut that high up, then the load's going to get stuck, right? According to the rabbis, if the load is higher, then, and you can only cut if it gets low, right, to the person, well, then a load will go by on the camel and it'll be totally stuck and there'll be no way for it to get through. And they can't imagine that that would be the case. So, elamai shiur de Rabbanan nafish. Well, let's go the reverse then. Okay, you're going to have the same problem. If you say that the donkey rider is taller, and Rabbi Yehuda says only cut if it goes low as the load, not as high as a donkey rider. So how's a guy riding on a donkey going to get by? So Rabbi Yehuda b'shiur de Rabbana, my avid. How's Rabbi Yehuda going to think that a person can go on a camel and get through if we can't cut the tree? So the obvious answer is that one is animate and one is inanimate, and therefore efshar degachim b'chalif tutei. If a person is riding on a camel and all of a sudden sees a branch, they'll just duck. Okay, whereas a load can't duck down. Okay, it doesn't see it coming, but a person would see it coming, and therefore you don't have to cut the tree because the person will just avoid the problem. And that proved basically that it must be that the person is taller than the height to cut for a person is higher than the load. Okay, and then again, there's a debate. Do you have to cut it for a person, or do you not have to cut it for a person because the person could just duck? And that's the machloka between them. Last line. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Kol Eilan Kineged HaMishkolet Mipnei HaTum'ah. Tana Mipnei Ohel HaTum'ah. Now, one Braita says it's for Ohel and Tum'ah. Now, our Mishnah just said Tum'ah. And this is Ohel, which I already explained to you is what the issue is. So Pshita Mipnei HaTum'ah. So the Gemara says, isn't that obvious? It says from Tum'ah. So why did you have to say Ohel? What's the difference? Well, Imi Matnitin, if it just said Tum'ah in our Mishnah, as it says, you would have thought, Havamina Dilma Maite Olev Tum'ah V'Shadehatam. Maybe the concern is that a raven will bring something tummy into the tree and it will hang out there. And then it'll, be over people, there'll be like something tummy on top of people, or maybe it'll fall on them. So therefore, you might think then, if that were the case, you could just thin out the branches, cut most of the branches off. And then if a raven put something there, it would fall right away. And then it wouldn't get stuck in the tree and it wouldn't create more tumah problems. And then that would solve your problem. And then you don't have to cut the tree. Hamashmalan that no, the ohel is the issue, and will be an issue even if you just have one branch there, because again, you're going to create more tummy situations, because if there's one little bone at the bottom underneath, or one piece of flesh of a dead body, and the whole branch goes over that, then anywhere under that branch is going to create more impurity. And therefore, it doesn't matter if you thin out the branches in the tree, you're still going to be able to, you can basically cut all of them, okay, because that's not going to resolve your issue. And with that, Hadran alaf lo yafol, that we finish the Mishnah, the chapter, and move on to a whole new topic about chazaka, how to create chazaka on land, chazaka of shalosh shanim. We'll talk about that. Different chazakas actually come up in the parak as well. Anyway, with that, we'll finish. We'll just do a quick review. The beginning was Ulla and his 16 cubit measurement. Where did he get it from? We had to turn squares into circles and talk about theories of pi and, pi r squared, and to figure out where he got to the 16 cubits, even though it wasn't an exact measurement in the end anyway. Then we have basically 4 of one type question on him, another 5th question, and then we had Rabbi Yochanan either holds like him or doesn't hold like him, depending on the version. And then we got into who can cut down trees that are veering into their own property or veering into the public domain, and what are the rights of the public and what are the rights of the individual to deal with trees, and depending on the scenario. With that, we'll finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day, a quiet day, and should have besorot tovot.